Hi, my name is Jeff Sapansky, and I'm here today to talk about why isn't technology making us more productive? Or maybe you might say why technology isn't making us more productive. In other words, we're going to try to answer that question a bit today. But before I dive in, I just wanted to share that this talk was actually originally put together for the Business to Software Conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, back in September. So hopefully you'll enjoy the content here, and I'm happy to talk about and interact around this if anybody ever wanted to reach out at me. And I'll have my contact information and stuff at the end of the deck. In any case, before I dive into the talk itself, maybe just a little bit more about me. I'm, as I said, Jeff Sapansky, or more commonly known in the industry, I guess you could say, as Tall Jeff. I'm founder and CEO of Reframe. My background actually is in electrical engineering. The first half of my career was really as CTO, VP of engineering, and what you might think of as like head of product roles. And I founded two different companies. Actually, Reframe is my third company that I founded. And I've also been COO, Chief Operating Officer of three other companies now in total before founding Reframe. And also have three exits to my name. One of those was the company I founded called Allworks, a voice over IP technology company. Another one was where I was COO of Sphere Knowledge Limited that was acquired by Twitter in 2021. And then also the big exit, sort of my claim to fame, a key part of my career was as Chief Operating Officer of Stack Overflow, which had a $1.8 billion exit with a B. So that's a total of three exits. I'm also a two-time dad, and like to say that my wife's had two exits too, I guess you could say. A total of 5 exits in the family. And now again, founder and CEO of Reframe. So that's probably enough about me. I want to dive into the topic here in terms of why isn't technology making us more productive? And the research here is actually really interesting. There's been quite a bit of work done on trying to understand what's going on here. Clearly, over the last several decades of using computers and our desktop GUIs and computing environments, the task level of productivity has clearly improved. But what we're really starting to see now in the last sort of couple generations of the technology over the last decade is that we're essentially suffering from information overload. So it's this idea that we're sort of being overwhelmed by the success of the platform, you might say, in a way. So to dive into this, I'm going to break this talk into 3 specific parts here. The first one is around understanding the problem a little bit more. Not just the symptoms of the problem, but also a little bit of kind of a deeper understanding of what we think is going on here. And then in the second part of the talk, I want to decompose and really put more labels to how we think about knowledge work, or a way to think about knowledge work that might be much more helpful and interesting to help us solve the problem. And then from there, we're actually going to build up a framework with some tools and techniques that we can use, I think, to show the direction that we can take things to get back on the productivity curve and continue having the technology helping us in new and better ways again, in a sense. And so that's really part 3 then of this. So before I do part 1, though, there's a quote that I really like. It goes back a long time now, and it goes something to the effect of, talent hits a target no one else can hit, but genius hits the target nobody else can see. And what I really like about this quote is it really hints in my mind to the idea that kind of figuring out new things, having really good insights, comes down to really having the right vocabulary for talking about the problem. In other words, the leap really comes once you have very specific ways of talking about the problem, and that sort of leads the way to solutions and options for solving it. And so in some ways, this talk is basically trying to do that, right? Put the vocabulary around this so that we can think about what we're trying to do with knowledge work in sort of better, more precise ways. And there won't be really anything too earth-shattering in this from the standpoint that necessarily terms you haven't heard before, other people haven't talked about. What I'm really trying to do here is really put this together into a coherent framework as we work through this. So we really can start to see what the opportunities are for the technology. Part 1 here, understanding the problem. There's a great tweet here I found on the internet by a guy named Joe Leach, who actually is now part of the Reframe team, but he wasn't at the time. And I'll let you read the quote yourself about this idea of, did you get the Zoom link with the Google Doc from the Miro board that I slacked you, kind of thing. And in a lot of ways, I think we all feel and know exactly what it is. And it's not even really an exaggeration in his example here. We literally experience this every day. And I think the other one that we kind of see and almost take for granted in like a boiling frogs kind of sense is the fact that here's the messy desktop that we all deal with every day. And like, what's going on here? Like, what do I do first? Do I mark it on red? Do I put it in my notepad? Do I forward it on to somebody? Like, we're sitting here managing the desktop completely manually. And if you kind of look behind the curtain here, the really funny thing to see is that you have to ask yourself, what's the difference here? I mean, we literally took all of the paper on our messy desktop from the physical desktop of the file folders and pieces of paper and actually just put them right onto the computer screen. And we didn't fundamentally change anything. And this core idea that all we've done in knowledge work is digitize the paper is really kind of the first thing to start realizing that something's missing here. But at the same time, it's really hard to see what the computers aren't doing there that they could be doing. And so the moral of the story here is really that if we start to dig into this, if we look at all the different sort of tools that we have in the productivity space, whether it's even the latest AI tools, but sort of workspace collaboration apps, the different communication tools and Office Suite or G Suite, all of these are really just, you'll realize, digital forms of physical paper proxies, whether it's your contact list, whether it's your Trello board, whether it's even a Gantt chart or a project plan. Of course, it's much easier to edit these digital things than they were the analog versions of those before we had the computers. But in a sense, you start to see that we're doing the work in our heads and the computer is just capturing that for us. Even with AI is really, just another form of helping you, bring one form of digital paper in and giving you more digital paper. And so if you start to look at this, what you start to see then is that the task level domain work at this digital paper level is really the only thing that we've been automating so far. And that there, in effect, is a whole other kind of work that's the thing that we're doing in our heads that doesn't have any tools or automation associated with it. It's essentially absent. And this is really the coordination level work, the meta work of bringing all those pieces of digital paper together into meaningful things that create a workflow. Or in the digital form of this, your applications on your desktop. How is the computer helping us orchestrate those things together to get things done? And you just start to see that that's all on us, basically, this coordination thing. And so, the moral of the story is that there's really fundamentally two types of work. The work that we're doing at the task level, the domain level, and that's been assisted through the digitization of the paper, but that the meta work is completely unautomated at this point. And this, of course, sheds light on sort of the opportunity here of what we're really trying to do to start fixing this. And so if we keep going from that, we start to ask ourselves, like, what is it that's kind of happening here? And I think there's actually a really good book written by Cal Newport that's called A World Without Email. And he actually put some vocabulary to this idea that if you think about the digital desktop in terms of what we're doing with it every day, no one really designed it to be more productive. I like to say that it's much more focused on computer science than brain science, because what we were really doing with the desktop and the desktop environment, the work environment that we use every day with our computers, it wasn't designed to be more productive. It was actually designed to solve the computer science problem of how do you run 5 different applications on the computer at the same time? How do you switch between those applications? How do you allocate memory and processor resources to those things within the computer? It wasn't, again, designed to say, I got 50 tabs and 27 windows, and what do I do to bring those together to get something done? It wasn't trying to figure that out. And in some sense, this is where I like to say that it's been a victim of its success, its own success. And again, this is where, going back to Cal Newport, he talks about this as the hyperactive hive mind workflow, basically, that, in a sense, we built this thing, and the way we work now in this craziness across the applications and silos is just sort of what emerged from the structure based on the computer science, not trying to make us more productive. And so with that, I'm hoping you start to get a better sense of kind of what's going on with the problem. So the next step here is to dive into part 2 and to talk about decomposing the knowledge work itself a bit more. And so, the neat thing about, a lot of what we're doing in tech nowadays, software, the software that runs our computers, the businesses that are all software-based, the growing parts of the economy, where all the knowledge work is happening, the neat thing to think about with software businesses is that they're sort of the purest form of knowledge work. In other words, us trying to do work together to develop software applications, and these different aspects of everything that we deploy into the workforce, is really fundamentally all just knowledge work. In other words, a software company developing software to solve these technology problems, whether it's AI or a next productivity app, really is just the purest form of knowledge work. And this is really neat to think about, because you start to ask yourself, well, what are we really trying to do then? Like, what is knowledge work? In the literature, they have a really great term for this. It's called collaborative cognition. And this, I think, nicely puts a label on what we're trying to do. In other words, we're all trying to think of new things. It's very virtual. Design new software, write new applications, invent new things in this virtual world of computers and computer software. But how do we do that together effectively? How do we even do it ourselves effectively with the tools we're being empowered with from the computer itself? And the term for this, collaborative cognition, and this, when we're thinking about this, it's like, okay, well, what do we know about cognition? How do we think? What do we know about thinking? What do we know what we're trying to do when we're thinking? And it's kind of neat to realize that, we take a lot of this for granted because it just comes natural to us to be thinking and doing things. And I think there was a really good book read, it's very popular, many people know it, by Daniel Kahneman, called Thinking Fast and Slow. And exactly as the title implies, he alludes to the idea that there's fundamentally two types of thinking. And so when you start thinking about doing knowledge work, you start to you realize like, oh, interesting, there's kind of two different types of thinking going on here. And one of the morals of the book that's really interesting is this idea that in the thinking fast and slow, we learned that the thinking fast is very intuitive, almost like sometimes emotionally driven, or just sort of automatically driven decisions that we make, and based on survival instincts fundamentally from an evolution standpoint. And what we find about the thinking slow in the two kinds of thinking is that the thinking slow turns out to be often a post-rationalization of the instantaneous conclusion you came to based on the thinking fast. And so you're essentially jumping to a snap judgment and then trying to explain why you came up with that judgment after the fact. And this can obviously have its pitfalls. We have biases and preconceived notions, things that we don't completely are aware of, and start to realize that everything that we're reasoning about could just really be trying to justify something that isn't really all that factual or true to the world. It's just what our instinct told us to do or say or think. But at the same time, the book also talks about another really interesting idea, is that all the brilliant insights come from exactly the same place. They talk about examples in the book where people can immediately tell if something's an artifact that was an ancient artifact. Is it authentic, or did somebody fabricate this? And like experts can immediately tell, and might not even be able to explain to you why they can tell the difference. And so there's this really attractive thing in the thinking fast side of things, is that it's both good and bad, and it's always followed by this post-rationalization that could be helpful or to explain the insight and what to do with it, or it could be very unhelpful because we're sort of just making up something without realizing it. And so in the takeaway from the book, I think, is that there's these two different types of thinking, but they don't really answer the question of how to realize whether it's the good kind of thinking fast or the bad kind of thinking fast, and when are we doing which. And the thing I'd like to say here is, in a sense, that Daniel Kahneman was wrong, or at least he underspecified this, and that there's really not two kinds of thinking, but I'm going to show you why there's actually 5 kinds of thinking. And one of them is exactly what he talks about in the book. The thinking fast stuff, the action-reaction instinct is there, but where I'm going to go with this is show you how that the thinking slow really breaks down into 4 different types of thinking. And it's in this idea that you go sort of beyond just the simple definition of his thinking slow and the post-rationalizations and irrational thought that we put on top of thinking slow. And what we're going to want to do is take a step back and think about how to close the loop around the 2 different types of thinking that he identified, with some more layers, so that we can tell when those things are doing the right things and when they're serving us well, and when those things are not serving us so well, basically. And in the pyramid that you see on the slide for the thinking fast, and then in the 2 kinds of thinking, or even now here on the slide with the 5 kinds of thinking, the reason for the pyramid is just to represent this idea that we're genetically disposed to do the lower levels of thinking better. In other words, primarily through evolution, we're really good for survival instinct reasons of having snap judgments and jumping out of the way of somebody trying to attack us, or some animal or something. These are survival instincts. They come very natural to us. And then the slow types of thinking essentially come less and less natural to us and require more and more sophistication and structure around it to do them well. They're much more acquired skills over a period of time. And so that's the reason for the pyramid there, that if we start to identify what these are. And so part of what I'm trying to do with the process of going from 2 levels of thinking to 5 here as we identify it is really square up this triangle so that all the levels of thinking can be used as equal assets, essentially. And so if we build a system that closes the loop around these, we can know when we're thinking thinking fast and having it be useful, and we can start to identify the cases where the thinking fast is getting in the way, various forms of cognitive biases and stuff. So that's what we're going to do. This is going to lead into the next part of the talk, into part 3 of actually filling out this framework. And if you're looking at the slide here, where the question marks are, to start to fill those in. And some of this is going to look familiar, but what I'm hoping to do here for you is glue it all together in a nice coherent framework so we can really understand why these things are needed and how they interact with each other. And if you're looking for kind of like a visceral way of thinking about this, this gets a little bit academic-y with the framework, and I'm hoping you'll follow along through this because I'm going to try to give you some really good tools that we can even use without the technology doing these things for you, things that we can identify in our businesses, running our teams, trying to get things done with knowledge work. We're going to put some vocabulary to it to help things along, but also, I want to also leave you with here before we jump into it a visceral feeling of what we're trying to solve for. And it gets into these ideas that there's these, just recently on the internet, big arguments and debate around founder mode versus management mode, and execution eats strategy for breakfast, or a vision without a strategy is an illusion. We have all these different statements. Sometimes, they're all useful wisdom at some level, but the problem with these is we don't always know, out of all the different examples we have of these different types of quotes, which ones apply when. And my claim here is, even within a single book, like Lean Startup, great book, puts a lot of vocabulary to a lot of things, but you'll see here on the slide a bunch of quotes from Lean Startup, and you kind of have to laugh because they're not exactly contradictory, but you really can't be doing them at the same time. And so these are useful things, but we don't, again, know where to apply them where. And so part of what this framework is going to do is tell you if you have a strategy problem, or if you have an execution problem, or if you have a vision problem. This is what it's really trying to help you see, and how this stuff comes together. And so in a sense, there's all these false dichotomies between these statements, and what we're going to do is try to figure out how you can break all those. So that's what we're really trying to do. That's what it's all about, eliminating those. So now, for part 3, our framework here for knowledge work. We're going to start filling in the question marks, and this is exactly where we get back to the quote about putting the vocabulary to the things that are really kind of hard to see right now. We're going to put labels on it and talk about how this all fits together. And one really useful thing that we're going to kind of use through this building up the framework is some really good terminology. We use this a lot at Stack Overflow between myself and Joel Spolsky, the founder. When we were thinking about activities we were doing and planning things, and you undertake projects, you have this sort of notion if what you're going to do is like core to your business and sort of critical to your success, things you're differentiating around, doing new, different, better than somebody else, in a sense where you're innovating, versus whether you're drawing on the context from the industry. So this idea of core versus context is there. And again, when you would undertake something, we're going to do a sales process or a customer support thing, or even to implement an algorithm in software for solving a problem. Do we take the stuff off the shelf that we can get from existing libraries in the software case? Do we use standard B2B software process, or selling processes, I should say? Or are we going to innovate there and do something unique or different in the way we go to market, or in the way we develop the technology, the product? This is this idea of core versus context. And we're going to see that when we use this thinking of identifying what's going on in our organization, and even just labeling it as core versus context, can be very useful. But for now, what I want to do is just to really talk about this idea, to sort of realize that core things, new that you're inventing, in a sense, are always thinking slow stuff. Because we're inventing something new, and when you're doing something new and learning something or inventing something, doing something for the first time, it can't be the reactionary stuff, or if it is, it's certainly not helpful. Because this is where, when something new is happening, it's not necessarily going to serve us well. And so we have the idea that thinking slow roughly maps to core stuff, and also gets into, in the two kinds of thinking, to the two types of work, or that I talked about up top, is that we'll see that the coordination thing is almost always the thinking slow stuff. And then the other half of it is context, that we're leveraging existing context from the industry, things that people are already trained in, skilled at. You can hire somebody to do that, or at least hire somebody knowledgeable in that. And in a sense, this is the thinking fast stuff. We can follow standard processes and expect sort of predictable outcomes based on the instincts and experience of people pretty reliably. And so we're going to use those two terms, core versus context, as we go through this. So let's jump into it. Knowledge work decomposed here. We got our framework, and as I said before, we're going to start at the bottom here, right where the thinking fast comes in. And as we do learn from Thinking Fast and Slow, the book there, this is the place where a lot of cognitive biases get us in trouble. And so what I'm going to talk about is start identifying these things, because this is the things that we want to be able to see going on in the teams that we're trying to fix with the other types of thinking, essentially. And also leverage the insights from the Thinking Fast. But for now, we're going to kind of talk about this in terms of diagnostics that you can take advantage of, like right now in your teams. And so the first bias here that comes up, the diagnostic you're kind of looking for in teams when we're doing knowledge work, is this idea that I don't have enough time to get those hires done, the very hires that will give me more time to do other things. We better hurry up and start coding. There's going to be a lot of bugs to fix. Or why bother estimating a schedule? We can just use that time to get started sooner. And I've literally heard all of these at some point in my career, perhaps multiple times. They're intended to be sort of characteristics of what we show here in this picture, which is the caveman dudes pushing the cart forward with the square wheels and somebody trying to hand them the round wheels, and they're like, I don't got time for that. That's really the essence of this cognitive bias. And what I like to call this is, as a diagnostic, is time compression. It's this sort of false perception that you don't have enough time to do something that's going to actually help you get out of the situation you're in better, faster, easier. And this is extremely common, right? It's sort of like tunnel vision. You're tunneling in and you're sort of refusing help or taking a step back to solve the problem. And this, of course, comes from the fact that, again, from an evolutionary standpoint, we're problem solvers, and we see a problem and we immediately start to act. And the question is should we solve the problem in the context that it's even presented in? And this is great for survival, but the problem is in knowledge work, we're really never being, there's no literal fires going on, certainly the vast majority of the times. And so if you do have a fire, you do, a physical one, a real fire, you do want to react and not think about it, and that's helpful for survival, saving people physically, but it's never, in a sense, really useful in knowledge work. There's just rarely ever a situation where time compression helps you, and or the reactionary helps you here. And so that's the thing you want to be able to kind of see it and say it and realize that it's going on. It's also noteworthy to say tends to be hard to spot in yourself. That's the nature of tunnel vision. And so this is a really key thing in collaborative cognition, to be able to kind of see it from the outside and figure out how you sort of advise and coach people and figure out how to put a broader framework around it to sort of stave that off. The next diagnostic, I like to call, with a little bit of a giggle usually, gyration. And this is the best kind of graphic I could have for you here on the slide was, the dog chasing its tail. And this is just really any situation where people are kind of going back and forth, can't make up their minds individually, or a team is arguing over path A versus path B, or at a company level, there's this strategy versus this strategy, or that market versus that market, that in a sense never really gets resolved. And the crux of this gyration effect, it shows up in kind of different forms. It can be something very simple and mundane in a simple meeting. It can be something, just arguing over some minor point. Bike shedding, if you're familiar with the term, is kind of a specialized form of gyration, where you sort of have this cognitive bias not to talk about hard problems, so we argue about easier problems that everybody has an opinion on. But it's always this case at its root where we're debating between option A and option B. And we're sort of told, Ben Franklin talked about the pluses and minuses chart, where you have one option and you list all your advantages and disadvantages of doing that, and then we list on the other side the advantages and disadvantages of doing the other thing, and we're supposed to pick between them. But I'm here to tell you that Ben Franklin was wrong about that, and the idea that you want to compare and contrast two different possible paths forward against each other is fundamentally wrong, or very limiting. And so we'll explain that more as we get through the frameworks and the different types of thinking slow, but we just want to be able to put a label on this idea of, I think we all know what we're talking about when we see these different sort of unresolved things in conversations or in teams or in companies, that you're in gyration. And this is something you want to be able to attack and come up with tools to help fix. And then the last one, this one's a bit more subtle in some ways, but I call this diagnostic best effort. And what this is about is the idea that, again, it's sort of this problem-solving instinct of humans. We jump to solving it. But it's like we have some outcome we have in mind, and we immediately start to think of solutions, and then we tend to kind of debate those solutions. That's the gyration thing in a lot of ways. But the point I'm trying to make in best effort is that we basically think about what it is we're trying to accomplish in terms of a goal, come up with a set of tasks to allegedly accomplish that goal, and then move forward. And best effort is the case where you either haven't specified what's the right amount of resources and time to allocate to that activity. In other words, we don't quantify the cost. That's sort of one characteristic of best effort. But the other more important one, actually, in a lot of ways, but more subtle, is the idea that when we have a goal and we write a set of tasks and then we complete the tasks, we tend to say, cool, done, accomplished, mission accomplished. But the problem is what was actually the goal, and did the thing that you designed those tasks to accomplish relative to the goal actually happen? Or how precisely did it happen relative to what you actually wanted to have happen? And that's why I call this best effort. It's like, oh, we got this problem to go solve. We all go work on it really hard and move forward and see what happens. And that's all great and well intended, except that you want to start to see how we're not closing the loop back to how good did we do against what we were supposed to do. And in some sense, what we're going to see here is that what best effort lacks is a really clear hypothesis about what's supposed to happen, and use that hypothesis to gauge what we can learn from executing the tasks on the task list. So that's level 0, the thinking fast, and the kind of 3 core diagnostics that I like to use to really think about what's going on there. And so if we want to start attacking these things and have tools for this, this is where the next level of thinking comes in, level 1 thinking. And basically, level 1 thinking is just a plan and planning. It's a way to achieve an outcome, the goal. But this then raises the question, like, what is a plan? But before I dive into that, it's like, what I want to kind of do is see that when there's sort of the difference between execution, which is the thinking fast stuff. You know what we want to do, we just go do it without thinking about it a whole lot because we know how to do that thing and we're skilled in it. The idea of implementation is the fact that you do a bunch of thinking fast activities in series to accomplish some outcome. And that's why we call this implementation of something. Presumably or hopefully you're implementing a bunch of things to accomplish the goal. But what we want here, to make this more precise, is a clear definition of plan and what is a plan. And so I formally define a plan as this time series set of actions, the kind of the things on the task list that are bounded by time and resources, that deliver an outcome with an assumed high level of confidence. In other words, we believe the plan is low risk and we understand how it's going to impact the goal. And in fact, we want to formalize the idea that we want to have a strong hypothesis around how it's going to achieve the goal. And in the terms of the layers of the thinking, the reason this stacks up on top is because, in a sense, the plan is just the justification, the explanation, the hypothesis for all the actions you're going to take so that you can fundamentally learn from execution. And that's really what we're trying to do here. But it does sort of raise this interesting question that almost seems kind of crazy to ask. And hopefully this is not too simple of a thing, or maybe it kind of seems obvious, but maybe it's not so obvious is what I'm trying to say. And this is the idea of like, well, what's even the difference between a goal and a task? In other words, a goal is an outcome that is achieved in the world. Presumably if you achieve it, tasks are things that you do, an outcome. It's just sort of a mini outcome. And the goals are sort of broader outcomes. But if you think about this, it's sort of like turtles all the way to the bottom. And so you do kind of have to wonder, like fundamentally, where do we want to draw the line at the level we're thinking about implementing it? In other words, like anytime we undertake a plan and we put down the tasks, any task can always be broken down further so that it's like a mini goal. In other words, I can say I want to write a strategy document. Is that a task or is that a goal? And then if we say write a strategy document, it's like, okay, do I want to specify the task all the way down to opening up the tools, typing on the keyboard, saving the document? Or do we just say write the document? And so you can see that one person's sort of goals is another person's tasks. And it's kind of hard to see where you are in that stack up without a more formal definition here. And that's the thing I'm trying to bring to the table, is that you're only separating the idea of goals from tasks when you can define a goal and then talk about several different ways of accomplishing that all achieve the same outcome, that all hit the goal. So in other words, you got to be able to say and talk about how there's different ways of getting to the goal, and then the goal is actually distinct from the tasks that are underneath it that are implementing the goal. And this is going to lead to a very important sort of concept here at this level one thinking. The essence of the level one thinking then is that you've completely divorced the goal from the way it's being implemented. And this is really important because of our problem-solving nature. We're always jumping to the answers, the solution to the problem that the goal alludes to, or the problems that need to be solved to achieve the goal. We always jump to the answers and debate the answers without really clarifying the goal. And so that's why this is so important. This is what we're really trying to do when we're planning, is to really talk more about the goal than the actual actions in it, at least at the start. And so, yeah, you're only really doing this until you separate them. For programmers in the room or watching this video, this is the idea of interface versus implementation and sort of object-oriented programming. We want to separate out looking at the black box from the outside and kind of how it appears to work or what it does from what's actually inside of it accomplishing that outer persona, if you will, of the interface. So that's really the essence here of level one thinking. That's what we're trying to do, and that's how we clearly, distinctly isolate it from the thinking fast at the next level below. The tool we want to apply here is what's called quality attributes. Quality attributes is a term I stole from system engineering. Formally in system engineering, quality attributes are basically the definition of goodness from the user or the customer's point of view of the thing. In other words, if we're going to build or do something, try to achieve something, what does it mean to achieve it well, essentially? And this can be put on anything. What does it have to be? A good airplane, a good car, a good software application. Let's list all the things that are definition of good without describing how good is accomplished yet. And that's where the point of the quality attributes then is to start to create this separation from the properties of achieving the goal well from the solutions you're choosing to use to achieve the goal, the technology under the hood. And you'll actually notice a parallel there to jobs theory if you read the Clayton Christensen stuff. In jobs theory, what we're fundamentally talking about in jobs theory is how to do the job well. What does it mean to the customer to do the job well without actually defining the product and how it achieves that thing? It allows you to have this sort of abstract understanding. And this is super interesting then for our planning activities, right? What we're trying to do is use the quality attributes to basically synthesize and different types of options and compare them against the quality attributes, not against each other. And that's how you break the loop on gyration. That's how you start to avoid best effort. That's really the key in the level one thinking. So there's a nice little process we can follow here then, just to make this a little bit clearer, I think. We start off with the goal and talking about the goal and what does it mean to achieve the goal well. The list of all the things to say in this dream state of that goal being achieved in the ideal way, what we want to do is list all the properties of what it looks like in that future state to describe everything that's good about the outcome, but ignoring how we actually even achieve the outcome. That's really the idea. This reverses the process and creates the space to be creative to say, well, what are all different ways that we could do that? And that, of course, is then from the quality attributes leads to the plan. But you'll see now when we generate plans with each other collaboratively in light of the quality attributes, we hopefully stop arguing about the solutions compared to each other, and we're only ever talking about each individual solution relative to the quality attributes. This breaks the dichotomy, this ends the gyration, and really, the key point is that it's turning the implementation that you're going to do, that execution, from sort of a guess and saying, if we do these things, we think we're going to get the goal, into a strong hypothesis that we learn from. Anything that deviates from the strong hypothesis is all opportunity for learning. Otherwise, we're basically executing in sort of the form of a guess. There's a great process to follow here for this. It's called the GROW model. It's from a book called Coaching for Performance by John Whitmore. We don't have enough time here to get into it, but if you look at the model of it, it actually starts with the goal. And this was actually used for coaching people, hence the title, Coaching for Performance, helping people align and make decisions together. If you want to align, instead of argue over things, basically we start from the goal. We talk about the reality, the R in GROW, of your current situation. This is where the quality attributes come in. This allows us to synthesize various options for moving forward, and then we choose what we're going to do based on what we all believe, given that process, is the right thing to do, essentially there. So that's the idea. A key tool there is the GROW model to put the plans together in the right kind of way. And so that's level one thinking. So now where do we go next? You might be able to guess this one. We talk about it a lot. It's a much maligned term in businesses, I think, often, or at least misunderstood, if nothing else. And this is strategy. So the level 2 thinking is the essence of strategy, or the essence of level 2 thinking is strategy. And the simplest way to talk about strategy without making this too complicated is just thinking about it as a way to prioritize plans and the resources put against those plans. That's really all strategy fundamentally is. And so the diagnostic around level 2 thinking, if we want to try to isolate this and understand it independent of the other layers, we start to realize that the first diagnostic, the thing that's kind of going wrong when strategy is not complete or effective enough, is that the priorities are unclear. In effect, so the job of strategy is to allocate resources and provide a way to answer every single question about prioritization. So then the corollary of that, if you flip it around, means anytime anybody's confused or doesn't understand priorities or how to allocate resources in the organization, you have a strategy problem, or at least you have a problem communicating the strategy. It's not well understood enough. And so that's actually fundamentally a pretty straightforward way of talking about strategy. And recently I've seen some posts that are really interesting. Dharmesh Shah, from co-founder of HubSpot, had a post talking about the 3-body problem. And in that post, he talks about the idea that when you have a one-product company, it's actually very straightforward to make decisions and to decide what you're going to do, because in a sense, everything is aligned against solving for that one particular product. But then lo and behold, as soon as you turn into a 2-product company, everything seems to get much, much more complicated. And he terms this the 3-body problem. And to be clear, it's a very real problem. But the thing that I thought very interesting in that whole discussion around it, with all the great examples that he gives of it, is that nowhere in there that we mention the point of strategy. And so when I look at that from sort of a COO perspective, what I see is that strategy answers every single question in the so-called 3-body problem. And so what's happening in a company when you go from 1 product to 2 is that the strategy is very straightforward in a 1-product company because all the resources get prioritized to one thing. As soon as we go to 2 products, now the individual products need to be like strategic objectives or mechanisms through which those 2 products working together in your business create together, synthesize some broader outcome that you're actually trying to achieve. And so the strategy, in a sense, becomes super important as soon as you get to a 2-product company, because we need a framework to allocate those resources. And so that's what's really going on there. Our priorities are unclear. We need strategy. We need a better strategy, a more complete or clear one. And in terms of the layering of the model, what we can say is that strategy then is just the justification for the goals and the resources allocated against them. That's what the prioritization is doing for you. And that's how it stacks up as the next layer in the knowledge work stack. And this brings us back to core versus context that we talked about at top, and this idea that labeling things as core, as context, is a very important idea here in terms of a tool for clarifying and understanding your strategy, making it complete. And so the first example I like to give when we think about activities that we're undertaking, there's a really simple example of like tying your shoes. Would we consider that activity a core context or a core activity where we're inventing something? Or is this purely context that we can do completely out of habit? And of course, for us as adults, tying your shoes is clearly context, right? But my 4-year-old son get a bunch of his buddies together and found a shoe tying business and start throwing lots of shoes at him on a short deadline. Is that still context for them? And I'll assure you that it's not. You need to manage a company of 4-year-olds tying shoes much differently than you would manage a bunch of adults tying shoes. And at the other extreme, we can see, is putting a person safely on Mars. Is this core or is this context? Now, clearly that's core in any sort of objective reality here. Things need to be invented, and that overall we have to treat that like a core process. But just to sort of expound on the example, if we think about SpaceX and Elon Musk and Tesla and all the great technology that they've invented, so that Elon Musk can die on Mars. If I go to Elon Musk and say, hey, Mr. Musk, I got $10 billion for you in 10 years. Can you get me on Mars? And he says, sure, Jeff, I'm on it. I might be inclined to believe him. And the point in that is that, in my interface between me and Elon Musk, maybe I can assume that the way that gets managed is a context process, at least from the outside. And I don't think this is actually true, but I think you get my point relative to how core versus context is sort of depending on who you give it to. And the diagnostic here then, in terms of our strategy, is do we have team strategy fit? And this is where the bounding of resources in our plans is so important. In a sense, the canary in the coal mine relative to whether you're being effective at what you're doing is seeing whether your team tasked with a plan to achieve some goal can keep to the allocated resources and schedule. And where we're going to go with this whole thing basically is that the idea here is that when you put together a plan, you can only realistically bound it with resources and time with any degree of confidence if the activity is core. And that's like a really key assumption. Or to put it a different way, if you assume something, or I'm sorry, I actually said that backwards. If the activity is context, you can only put a reliable plan and deadline around something that is context to your team. And in the labeling of an activity as context, if you start to see that when you undertake this, that you're not achieving things with predictability relative to time and resources, then it starts to hint that the things that you've assumed in your business that are context are actually looking more like core. And this either means you have to redefine that as a core activity and start to tackle it differently, or you got to think about the team and their training and how they're being supervised or managed to achieve the outcome as like a signal. In other words, this is the thing that starts to tell us whether we got a strategy problem or whether we got an execution problem, or in some cases both. But with this vocabulary, you start to be able to see which knobs you're turning to try to solve this problem in a much more structured and predictable way. That's really where we're trying to go with this. And so, yeah, the moral of the story, if we really want to jump into this, is do you have team strategy fit? The label of something as core context is a core part of your strategy. And in a sense, what the strategy is doing is for the context things we can plan. And those are just elements as standard goals in your strategy to build plans around those things with the right resources. You're going to achieve them, hopefully, very reliably. The things that we identify as core or after the fact realize are more core, these are the things that need to be broken down into sub-goals or strategic objectives that actually are context for your organization. And this really is just fundamentally experimentation. In other words, for a core activity, we're inventing something. We can't schedule the invention, but we can schedule the experiments in the hands of the right team. And so it's this idea that when you want to synthesize things in terms of the broader things you're trying to achieve that are core in your organization, the idea is that you break them down into context-based pieces so that they can be done predictably. And as you learn from the experiments, now we can have a rational way to adjust and move forward with the strategy based on the learnings. And in a sense, doing anything else, I'm going to argue, is basically wishful thinking. If you're just going to push forward on core activities and kind of assume they're going to happen on any kind of reasonable resource or time deadline, you're kidding yourself, especially in an organization that, the more and more things that you're doing is core, the more and more differentiation you're creating, the more and more risk you're essentially taking on, and ultimately you're going to be disappointed in effect. So that's really the idea here. That's what this is all about at this level. And this really completes for us fundamentally level 2 of the model. This is strategy. Strategy is a justification for the resources and goals that we're achieving at level 1. Level 1 plans are the justification for the actions we're going to take, and this starts to nicely close the loop. So then the question is what's the next level of thinking here? What sits on top of strategy? And this is really, I call this the sort of paradigm. We're thinking about our paradigms, ways, the models or beliefs of reality or of the world is what comes in the level 3 thinking. And the idea here is that the first thing to realize is that it's the paradigm shifts in the level 3 thinking that is the root of all sustainable advantage in any company or with any product line. And that's the reason for this is, in a sense, what you're trying to do is take an existing paradigm in the world, some set of assumptions, technology about a certain market, and change those beliefs by inventing something new and causing a shift in the world from the current paradigm that everybody operates under into some new paradigm as a result of what you're trying to accomplish. And it's that progress or that process of you causing that shift is the thing that's going to be rooted in your differentiation and your sustainable advantages of business. That's really the idea there. And so, the idea is then that innovation and differentiation always is created by the current paradigm and creating a new one. And that's the essence of level 3 thinking. And what this really relates to, if you want to put it in sort of more common terms, we would talk about this, is your mission and vision. Your mission and vision is about the place you're going, given the current state of the world, the thing you're trying to accomplish. It's that shift that you're creating that's the level 3 strategy. And in a sense, the next level down, the strategy is there to help you accomplish that shift. In other words, the purpose of strategy is to cause the paradigm shift in the market. And that's how we start to really layer up the different levels of thinking there. And, you know, what we start to see then is if you think about the shift happening, people can only understand new things in the context of existing things. And so the first observation is that anything you're doing for sustainable advantage is by definition a core activity that needs to be broken down into structured ways, experiments to learn, but also that you're inventing some new model of the world. So for people to actually understand it, you have to have new vocabulary that explains how the new version of the world is going to be different from the things that people can relate to. And so like us, you know, if we're a founder of a company, or just running the company, sharing our vision, when people are kind of confused about what we're doing, what is rooted in is this idea is we can imagine these great kind of new futures in our heads as like founders thinking of this new future that we're creating. But we need to externalize that for other people. And the only way that other people can relate to the thing that we're thinking or imagine in our head is to do the process of coming up with the vocabulary to explain, relate it to things that they know already, and sort of explain the diffs. And this leads us to a really key tool here. It's something I call the Fro-to. I stole this term from somewhere, I can't remember exactly where. But in the Fro-to, it's the from in the to, in the paradigm shift is the tool. And so what you're trying to do is basically define, you know, very clearly with very clear vocabulary, the current state that you're anchoring people under or with, and then define the to of where you're going with your mission and vision. And so if we want to be effective in the level 3 thinking and getting people to understand us here and create this sustainable advantage, it's in the distillation, in a sense, of your mission and vision of the company into Fro-tos. If you don't have the Fro-tos to explain your mission and vision, then people really can't relate to what it is you're trying to do. Or if they can, what it really tells you, and this gets into like Crossing the Chasm and Jeffrey Moore and early adopters or the innovators in a market, the reason they adopt quickly and early is because they actually already imagined the thing that you're trying to sell or ship or build. You get to cheat because they see the solution and then immediately understand it because they've already envisioned that future. And they can help you do the transition, but if you want to help other people come along on the journey quicker on your own teams or even in the market to get the adoption to go much faster, we have to help all the people that didn't already see it take on the new thinking so that they can move along with you on your journey, basically. That's what the Fro-tos are all about, and that really gets to the essence of level 3 thinking here. So, starting with level 0, we have the action, reaction, instincts at the bottom. Those get justified by the plans at level 1. Level 2 is strategy, justification for all our plans. And the paradigm defines the playing field, the set of beliefs that we have that we're trying to change or make true in the market. And that's, in effect, the guidance or the container for everything we're doing in our business, including what the strategy and the layers below are trying to accomplish. So that actually seems pretty complete, right? But we can see there's still one more level of thinking here that's missing. And this is, in some ways, maybe almost the most important one, depending on how you think about this. Even though this model seems pretty complete, even with just up through level 3, the thing we have to acknowledge, in a sense, is that this entire set of beliefs, whether it's the Fro or the to, and everything that we're doing in the company, exists in some sort of like philosophical way of thinking about it. We have to talk about what's the underlying reality outside of the system that we just built using these 4 layers. And so where I'm going with this is the level 4 thinking is basically just the unknowable underlying reality of the world. And everything that we set on top of that is just a paradigm, is just a model that approximates the underlying reality. The models can be very useful. They are very useful in many cases, but they're not perfect. We would maybe talk about this as the idea that any abstraction, any model of something is always leaky. It's just never perfect. It's always an approximation. And to really drive home how kind of fungible this really is, we can even talk about physics here. Like, in other words, physics itself, which we believe thinking is very factual and describing the reality of the universe, are actually just paradigms too. And so if we can think of, like, this is a really quick example of, like, Newtonian physics. We had Sir Isaac Newton, and he starts talking about how the planets move and gravity and all this great stuff, and how you can be action at a distance through the gravity. And we have some very precise equations describing how the world works. And the problem is that even Newton himself couldn't describe where the forces of gravity were coming from. And of course, we know now that Einstein comes along many years later and starts to describe, oh, wait a minute, space-time continuum, the general theory of relativity. And there was a paradigm shift there. And in a sense, what you start to see is that Newton's model was very useful. It was a great paradigm, still is a very useful paradigm in most cases, but it was also wrong. It didn't explain the world completely. And Einstein came along and explained a whole bunch of new things, but we already even know that Einstein's model is incomplete. And people love to talk about, whether physics is like invented or discovered. And I find this really odd because I can absolutely tell you that both of them were invented by people because they're both wrong. And they do not explain the underlying reality completely. They're very useful models, but there's going to be better models that come along, even in physics. And so the point of this is like, if you want to step back, and this is where research in physics exists, you take a step back and say, oh, wait a minute, where is relativity not explaining things? We have to step outside the model and try to help explain what's going on. And this is where you get ideas, dark matter, dark energy. Maybe that's enough about physics, but the point here is that when we think about our models here, all of them are leaky, even physics. Certainly our business models are, anything that we have around our models. And so the whole idea here in level 4 thinking is to step out of our model and start to think about the things, understand its weaknesses, basically. And so the tool that I bring to the table here for you is what I like to call meteors. This is meteors in terms of like the meteors that killed the dinosaur. And as you see, you have the dinosaur here drinking his coffee, looking up at this star that keeps getting brighter, and pretty much ignoring what's going on. This is where the term comes from, right? The meteor that killed the dinosaurs. And the idea is to be able to sort of challenge our thinking. Sometimes they call this, red teaming things and stuff like that. What you're trying to do is discover your unknown unknowns to turn them into explicit assumptions. And all businesses take on certain forms of existential risk even. It's not like you need to eliminate them, but you basically want to keep an eye on them and identify them so that if circumstances are changing, you start to see the threat to what's going on. And the really ironic thing that I find about the meteors is that most companies actually know what the meteors are already. You just get used to ignoring them. And this is exactly why I use the dinosaur picture on the slide there with him drinking his coffee, is that we just, as humans, this is another cognitive bias. It's like, hey, there's been stars in the sky over there. No, it's interesting, it's getting brighter. But we also sort of sit there and ignore something about doing it. And so the two things I'm really trying to bring to the table here in the level 4 thinking, we could spend all day talking about different techniques and tools here. This is hard, but the idea is to start getting much more explicit about your assumptions, the entire framework of your paradigm shifts and the strategy and everything underneath it is built on so that we can be ahead of the curve on these changes. And in particular, the ones you already know about, you always got to be revisiting whether they are newly material to your situation. Because as we know, essentially all paradigms fall, all businesses fall eventually. Do you want to be on top of that or do you kind of want to ignore it? That's really the point here. And so we can be much better in our knowledge work, our strategies, and our businesses using the tool meteors to understand the strengths and weaknesses of everything that we're doing. So that's our 5 levels of thinking. Hopefully we understand better here too why it's not 2, just according to the book of Thinking Fast and Slow, what these 5 layers together are really trying to accomplish for you. But we might have lost track of the top level thread here. If we pop all the way back up, here's the really crazy thing to think about in the context of knowledge work, is that computers don't help you do anything that I've been talking about in here. All of this stuff we're on our own doing on ourselves. There's no structure for this in computers. We can put strategies in a document, we can put our paradigms and our photos and our plans in the spreadsheets and project plans, but we're doing all of that work in our head without any help. It would be like we're still using digital paper to do CAD work instead of 3D CAD and simulations and models. There is literally no CAD equivalent of, or even compiler equivalent of knowledge work. We're doing this completely on our own. And so in a sense, computers are going to actually make us more productive when we start having the computer help us do everything that I was talking about. Does the computer give me a way to label something core versus context? Can I have a way of structurally specifying what our strategy is so the computer can help me analyze it? When I put together a project plan, Is this a core activity or a context activity in there? Are people suffering from time compression or gyration? If we want to really start thinking about how using AI in better and useful ways besides generating more digital paper, we start to realize we need to build a grammar, a more purposeful structure around all this, so that that context can be leveraged for the computers to help us much more. That's where we'd really like to go. That's what's missing. This is why technology isn't making us productive anymore, is because we've basically milked the paradigm that we're using right now almost completely, and we're just on diminishing returns point. We need to make the leap into the computer helping us a lot more. Reframe, my business that I founded, is here to lead this journey. This is what we're all about. We are here about making computers make the leap to the next generation of knowledge work, where all of these different things come into play on the desktop. We've actually broken this down into 4 seasons in terms of our overall strategy that we're trying to create. And I talk about this as seasons in terms of a television series. Each one of the seasons kind of is an arc building on the next. We break the seasons down into episodes. And just this month, the very first prototype of the first season, I guess you could call it the pilot episode, is just starting to show up in users' hands now. And so hopefully you'll come along and join us on this journey as we start to make technology and knowledge work more productive for us again. Thank you.